Okay, so let's start with a review of what we did yesterday, or not yesterday, last week. So what we're gonna do is let's just look over what we did. So we had like four parts to like how we are supposed to play the opening. So one is first we move a pawn into the center. So and remember the center is these four squares. So d4, e4, e5, and d5. So these four squares are the center. So a pawn move to move into and attack the center could be like d4, e4, c4, something like that. Now usually f4 isn't a good move because let's say we play f4, with the king, it's kind of getting weaker. Okay, so let's start with um Nicole. Do you have a question? Oh yeah, kind of. So, well, it's not like Scholar's Mate, because Scholar's Mate is, remember, it's like when you play something like this. But yeah, it's just not a very good move. In the like, oh, wait, can everyone else see my screen? Okay, wait, could you try leaving the meeting and rejoining? Yeah. Okay, so we know that f4 is not a good move. So let's just stick with e4, d4, e4, d4, and c4. One of these moves. I suggest you guys play e4 because your bishop and queen gets active. But it just depends on your preference. So now we start with a pawn move into the center. Then our opponent, he's also going to respond with a pawn move into the center if he's following the opening principles, right? And then our second step of our plan was to bring one knight into the center, at least one. So in this case, you can bring out knight here or knight here. So let's say we bring out this knight, and black does the same thing. Then we can either bring out the other knight or we can bring out one bishop. So like we can bring out our bishop there or bring out our knight here. So let's say we bring out our knight. Alright, now um we develop our bishops. So something like this. So let's just right now what we've done so far is we have our three steps of our plan. We have first we have to move a pawn into the center. Then we have to develop at least one knight into the center, at least one, so one or two. And then third we have to develop one bishop into the center. So after we develop one bishop, usually the bishop that like allows you to castle. So like in this case if you're white, there's a light squared bishop. Once you move that, then you can castle, right? So that's what we usually want to try and do. Because now our next step of our plan is to castle. And castling, what it does is it gets your king into safety. Because in this position here, this pawn has moved to e4, right? So it's kind of like a bit weak. The king, I mean. So once you castle, there's three pawns right in front of it to protect the king. Nicole? Yeah, so does everyone know what long castling is? If you don't, you can just like raise your hand in the chat. Okay, that's fine. So I'll just like quickly explain it. I think we looked at it for like a second. last class, but we don't have too much time, so I'll just explain it right now. Okay, so in this position, so there's castling to the right, which is called kingside castling because it's closest to the king. And basically, that is when you move your king 2 squares to the right, and then the king jumps over. Then there's castling to the left, which is uh, this is what long castling is when the rook is like this rook right here, it's 2 squares away from the king, right? But this rook, it's 3 squares. So that's why we call it long castling. And it's basically the same thing. You move the king 2 squares to the left instead of the right, and then the rook jumps over. And so you can see like that there is a slight difference. So if we go to the right, then there's 4 squares between the rooks, and there's 1 square uh like between the king and the corner of the board, right? If we go long castling, there's 3 squares between the rooks, so then they can like have better combos. But there's 2 squares between the king and the corner of the board. So what usually happens is if you castle kingside, it's like a more defensive setup. You're just trying to like play with the like normal opening and middle game principles, which middle game we'll learn about later. But uh if you go queenside castling or long castling as it's sometimes called, this is when you want to attack more because your rooks are closer together. They'll be able to combine much easier to like attack black. So does anyone have any questions on the two types of castling? No? Okay, so now let's go back here. So we saw that we just castled, right? So now let's say black also follows the same thing. So after we do this, then we continue to develop the rest of our pieces. So what develop basically means is get like a piece from their starting square and move them to a better square. So like over here, we moved our knight out. So that was developing the knight because it went from the starting square to a better square. And if you keep developing your pieces, you're just making them better and better. And that's good because it'll just like help it's it'll help like get you a better position for the middle game. Because if you had like a knight over here, just it wouldn't be very helpful, right? But knight over here, it's going to be more helpful. It's attacking a pawn like that. So then we continue to develop the rest of our pieces. So this rook, it's been castled, so technically it's already been developed, but it's not in the best square, right? It's just blocked by a pawn right in front of it. But usually, the method that we develop in is first knights, then both bishops, then the rooks, then the queen. So it's just like increasing order of like the points of the pieces. So right now we want to try and develop this bishop. Yeah, Evan? So like right now? Are you saying in this position? Yeah, so well yeah, the knight could move to g5, right? But and you're correct, nothing is attacking it right now. But let's say I play this pawn over here. Now this knight, it has to run back. Now you might be thinking, well, I can take this pawn. But then the rook takes, then the bishop takes, and the king takes. And now you lost two like minor pieces. So minor pieces is like a bishop or a knight. So you lost two minor pieces and you gained a rook. And most of the time, actually almost all of the time, the two minor pieces are better than the rook. So that's why you shouldn't be doing that. That's just another important opening principle to follow. You shouldn't move the same piece twice in the opening. Because if you do that, then yeah, this will happen. You just allow your black to play h6, and then you have to come back, and now it's their move again. So it's like you just gave them a free move. Alright, so Now let's go over here, right? So we have to try and develop this bishop. Now obviously it's blocked on both sides, right? It can't go either way. So what do you guys think is a good move to um develop this bishop? Evan or Rook maybe? Justin? Yeah, that's a good move. So pawn to d3 is probably the best move in this position because what you now allow is this bishop now has like a path, right? Has a lot more squares. In this position, it was blocked, and now that you moved it, this bishop has some squares that it can move to. Like next, you might want to go here, or something like that. So let's say black does this. He's now not allowing you to go here because imagine he played this move, and then you went here. Now, does anyone remember what this is called? The bishop is attacking the knight, and then behind the knight is the queen. Zane? Okay, never mind. Rito? Yeah, good job. So this is a pin, right? Because this knight, if it moves, then we can take the stronger piece behind it, the queen. So that's why black would try and play this move, because now you stop the pin. But you still have to develop this bishop. So you can go here, here. Yeah, these are only two squares, because what happens if you go here? Roma, you're on mute. Yeah, so the pawn on e5, right, can just take our bishop. So that wouldn't be good for us. So we can go here or here. Now this move, it doesn't really accomplish anything, right? This on this side, your bishop is just being blocked by our knight, and you're still looking at the same squares this way. That's why bishop e3 would be the stronger move. Now you're attacking the opponent's bishop, but you're being defended at the same time. So let's say they take, and we take. Now you can see that this bishop got, this rook got really good. Remember in this previous position, we said that this rook is not very good because it's being blocked by our pawn, right? But now after we did this, now this rook is no longer blocked by our pawn. And even though there's a knight in front of it, the knight can move out of the way later, right? It's not like, because remember, the rooks aren't very useful in the opening. They're more useful in the end game. So for now, we can just like try and get a rook to a good square, but it doesn't need to be a great square. So this is a pretty good square already for our rook. So we've gone that far, right? So let's just recap. So go to the beginning. So we have a pawn move into the center. That is our first step. Then we have moving at least one knight into the center. So in this case, we play knight c3. So we can also move both knights if we want. Then we move one bishop. We shouldn't try and move both bishops before we castle. So we should move one bishop, and that bishop is usually the one that's like not allowing the king to castle. So like the bishop right next to your king. So this one. Then we castle. Then we develop our other bishop. And finally, we continue by developing these three pieces. So these are called the major pieces. The queen and the rooks are the major pieces. The bishops and the knights are the minor pieces. So basically, now the way to develop these is like moving the queen here, like over here. Say we go, or we could move over here and then move the queen over here. It's not like we need to develop in one move. It's like sometimes you can develop the queen in two moves, or develop the rook, because like this rook has to come here, then here, then here, right? It's going to take some time. But that doesn't matter, because now we're beginning the second stage of the game, which is the middle game. And we'll be looking at that later. But for now, let's go over some more parts of the opening. So first, what happens if we play e4, or actually, yeah, let's give an example, d4, okay? And our opponent, he doesn't follow the plan. So what, remember the first step of the plan? Does anyone remember? Jetson? Yeah, so you have to try and attack the middle four squares of the pawn, right? So that means, like, let's say you could play here or something, right? But let's say he plays something like this. He moves the pawn here. And while it is attacking one of the middle four squares, it's kind of like a defensive move, right? It's only moving one square. So then if we do this, then we have to punish our opponent, right? Then we have to keep on moving pawns into the middle. So how can we do that? Evan? Yeah, nice. So then we push the other pawn to e4. And this is a very strong thing when you have two pawns on d4 and e4. And the reason that is because they control all four of the central squares. That makes them extremely strong. Then we can also try and put our knights here. You can see how we have so much space, right? Both the bishops can move so far, and the knights can easily move. We can castle, and then our queen can move like over here, like not there, but like can move a lot more freely. And that's why it's an extremely important thing. If your opponent does not move one of his pawns directly into the center, like in this case here, then you have to keep on trying to take control of the four middle squares. So in this example, we said e4, right? But let's say he moved his knight here. Now if he played e4, what would happen? Rito? Yeah. So in this case, this pawn is undefended, right? So the knight could just take it. But instead of e4, we can still try and take control of some central squares with our pawns. So what, instead of e4, what else could we play? Evan? Oh, okay. So does anyone have another way that we can Jeten? Okay, so c3. And what c3 does is we're trying to defend this pawn so that like takes more control. But that's not the best square for this pawn, and that's because this knight can no longer go to this square, right? Because this is like a really natural square for the knights. The knights go to c3 and f3. If we block that by playing c3 ourselves, then this knight is kind of doesn't have many good squares other than this. It has to go like knight to d2. So like let's say this knight to d2. Now this bishop is blocked and the queen is blocked. So you know how it's getting kind of cramped, right? So we don't want to play moves like c3 because they block our knights. So other than uh e4, what could be another move? Evan? Okay, so f4. Well, it's not a bad move in this position because the queen can't exactly come to this square and attack, right? But in the future it might not be like the best idea. He might still be able to attack the king. So like we should try not to move the f pawn in most cases until after we castle. After we castle, we can move the f pawn because then that's how we get our rook. Because remember, after we castle, our rook will be here, right? And that means that if we move this f pawn, then the rook gets more space. So instead of e4 or f4 or c3, the best move would probably be c4. So now this pawn attacks these two squares, and this pawn attacks this square. Now we're still unable to defend this square, attack it, right? But next move we can move our knight here and then try and attack this, right? So in ways like that, we have to try and get a lot of pawns into the center if our opponent doesn't put one of his pawns in the center. Because let's say he played here and he put one of his pawns in the center. If we tried this, then he'll just take. Nicole? Yeah, so sometimes like there is some gambit lines, and a gambit is basically when you sacrifice a pawn. So you give your opponent a pawn for free, so then you get like let's say you can take right now, right? But then you get a lot of you got a lot of squares in the center. Because remember, this pawn over here it was attacking defending these two central squares. But now once you play c4 and he takes, now he's not defending these two squares, so you can play e4 again or something like that. But I suggest for now, at the level you guys are, try to stay away from gambit lines. This, if you know how to play c4, then you can try it because this is pretty solid. But most of the time, I suggest you just start developing your knights like this. Because if you do this, then you'll just get like a lot easier game in the middle game. Okay, so that's what happens when your opponent tries to doesn't push his pawn into the center, right? So now let's say we just keep going, e4, e5. Oh, is there a question? Nicole? Yeah, so these are like more advanced openings, like the London system. You have to develop your bishop first to get an advantage, but uh, let's just look at more of the opening principles right now. So it's too far. Okay, there. We have to develop our knights, then our bishops, and then we castle. And then we try to develop our other bishop. And now let's just look at this position. So here we have two pawns right on top of each other. And does anyone know what these are called? Nicole? Yes. Yeah, so doubled pawns are most of the time they're not going to be good for your position because this pawn it's going to be blocking the pawn right behind it, right? So it's like instead of getting two for one, you're getting one for two. So it's not really helpful. But in this case, if you have doubled pawns in the center, it's not always a bad thing. Like let's say your opponent plays d6. He wants to try and develop his bishop, right? Now what you can do, and this is another step of our plan, so this will be our fifth step, sixth I think. So this is when we play a pawn break. And this is exactly where we transfer into the middle game. So a pawn break is when you move a pawn in the center, so the D or E files, right? Or F, right? So like one of these four files, because these are like the center files. Mainly it's the D or E files, but sometimes like the C pawn or the F pawn can still attack the middle squares, right? They can still attack the middle squares. But let's just focus on the D or E files for now. We'll look at some F file breaks as well. But basically, it's when you move up one of these pawns, so one of these three, right? Obviously, these two pawns can't move right now, so this pawn. So when you move it forward, and it's attacking one of black's pawns. And what this does is create something called tension. And tension in chess is pretty important because that's like it allows you to like capture a pawn and maybe win material. It can basically change the tide of the game. So what this does is you're attacking his pawn, and you are also trying to keep you're trying to keep this good center. Because remember, I said a pawn on d4 and a pawn on e4 at the same time. That's really good, right? Oh, Evan? Yeah. Yeah. But the thing is, we're not forced to take with our queen. And that's where doubled pawns in the center are good. Because this in this position we have these doubled pawns in the middle, right? So like the center D and E files. Now these pawns are actually good because what happens is we can play d4, and now once he takes, instead of taking with our queen or knight, that's not the best move, right? We'll take with our pawn instead. And now we don't have doubled pawns anymore, and we still have a pawn on d4 and e4. And now that means that we probably have a better position than black because we have more space. We're attacking all four of the squares in the center. Both our knights and our bishop are developed. This rook is developed. This queen can easily be developed, right? Like just go to queen d2 and then queen f4 later. And this rook is usually going to come into like e1 or d1. Most of the time in the opening and the middle game, you're not going to be able to move your second rook very easily. Like it's going to take some time. So try to develop at least one rook, the rook that you castle with. In this case, that was the rook on f1. Okay, so now let's just look at this. So we have first a pawn into the center. Then we have at least one knight into the center. Then we have one bishop into the center. Then we castle. Then we develop our other bishop. Then we try and get a pawn break. So that is, I think, 5 or 6 steps. So now once we play this pawn break, we move our pawns into like d4 and e4 and try to gain space. This is when we transfer it into the middle game. And the middle game, it's gonna be a lot more different. And we'll start learning that probably the class after next week. Cuz next class I have some like a mini quiz. So for the rest of today's class, I'm going to give you guys a few positions, and you guys have to try and tell me what the best move is, according to our opening principles. So let's say we start with c4, okay, to attack this square. Now opponent plays knight f6. Okay, so would the best move now be to play d4 or to play knight f3? Which move is better, d4 or knight f3, according to our opening principles?